Imagine being outnumbered, outgunned, flying a plane that everyone told you was second-rate, deep in the skies over a country that wasn't even yours, against one of the most feared air forces on the planet, and winning. That is not a movie plot. That is the true story of the Flying Tigers. Welcome. Today we are going deep into one of the most extraordinary chapters in the entire history of aerial warfare. We are talking about a group of American volunteer pilots who took a fighter plane that military experts considered inferior, flew it into the most dangerous skies in the world, and carved out a combat record so remarkable that military historians are still studying it today. This is the story of the P-40 Warhawk, the American volunteer group, and the legendary Flying Tigers who defended China when almost no one else would. And I want you to stay with me all the way through this, because this story has everything. It has courage that will make your jaw drop. It has strategy that will blow your mind. It has sacrifice, brotherhood, political drama, desperation, and moments of pure genius. By the time we are done, you will understand exactly why the Flying Tigers became one of the most iconic fighting forces in American military history, and why the roar of a P-40 engine still gives people chills to this very day. Let's start at the very beginning. To understand the Flying Tigers, you have to understand the world they were born into. And that world, in the late 1930s and early 1940s, was on fire. Japan had been expanding aggressively across Asia for years. By 1937, full-scale war had erupted between Japan and China, and the Japanese military machine was rolling through Chinese territory with terrifying efficiency. Japanese ground forces were brutal. Japanese naval power was formidable. And Japanese air power, specifically the pilots flying the Mitsubishi A6M0, was considered among the best in the world. China was suffering enormously. The Chinese Air Force was outmatched, poorly equipped, poorly trained by comparison, and simply overwhelmed by the sheer quality and quantity of Japanese air power. City after city was being bombed. Supply lines were being cut. The situation was becoming desperate. Now here is where the story gets fascinating, because help was going to come from the most unlikely of places. It was going to come not from the United States government, not officially at least, but from a small, quiet, intense man from Texas who was going to change the course of this entire war. His name was Claire Lee Chennault. Claire Chennault is one of those figures in military history who is genuinely difficult to categorize. He was brilliant, stubborn, controversial, and absolutely relentless. Born in Commerce, Texas in 1893, Chennault had fallen in love with aviation early in his career and had risen through the ranks of the United States Army Air Corps. But his career had hit significant turbulence, and that turbulence was almost entirely of his own making. See, Chennault had very strong opinions about air combat tactics. Very strong. And in the 1930s, the prevailing doctrine in American military aviation was that high-speed bombers were essentially unstoppable and that fighter planes were becoming obsolete for interception purposes. Chennault thought this was completely wrong. He believed passionately that fighter aviation, properly trained and properly employed, could absolutely intercept and destroy high-speed bombers. He wrote papers about it. He argued about it. He debated it loudly and persistently with his superiors. His superiors did not appreciate this. By 1937, Chennault was in poor health, suffering from significant hearing loss, and his military career was essentially stalled. He retired from the Army Air Corps as a captain. It looked like his story was over. But then came an invitation that would change everything. The Chinese government, specifically Madame Chiang Kai-shek, who was deeply involved in China's war effort and had enormous influence over international relations, invited Chennault to come to China and evaluate the Chinese Air Force. He accepted, and when he got there, he found both a disaster and an opportunity. The disaster was the state of Chinese air power. The opportunity was the chance to build something entirely new, on his own terms, using his own ideas, with no one looking over his shoulder telling him he was wrong. Chennault threw himself into the work. He studied Japanese aerial tactics obsessively. He developed an early warning network using observers on the ground across hundreds of miles of Chinese territory who would radio in reports of Japanese aircraft movements, giving Chinese and later American pilots precious minutes of warning before enemy planes arrived. He trained pilots. He studied. He planned. And he began to form ideas about how a smaller, seemingly inferior force could defeat a larger, more capable one. But he needed planes, and he needed pilots. And getting them was going to require some of the most creative bureaucratic maneuvering in the history of American military aviation. By 1940 and into 1941, the situation in China was critical. Japan controlled enormous swaths of Chinese territory. The Burma Road, which was the primary supply route bringing war material into China from the outside world, was under constant threat. Without supplies, without equipment, without air cover, China's ability to continue fighting was genuinely in question. Chennault went back to the United States and made his case directly to the highest levels of government. He argued that a relatively small group of American pilots flying modern fighter aircraft could make a decisive difference in the skies over China. He brought data. He brought analysis. He brought his observations of Japanese tactics and their weaknesses. And crucially, he had support from the Chinese government, which was willing to pay for the operation. Madame Chiang Kai-shek was extraordinarily effective at making China's case to American officials and to the American public. She was sophisticated, eloquent, and deeply persuasive. President Franklin Roosevelt was sympathetic to China's struggle, but could not openly commit American military forces to a conflict the United States had not officially entered. The solution they arrived at was elegant in its complexity and audacious in its conception. American military personnel would be allowed to resign their commissions temporarily, volunteer for service with a private organization called the Central Aircraft Manufacturing Company, serve in China, and then return to their American military careers afterward. They would be paid as civilian contractors. They would wear no American military uniforms. Officially, the United States government would maintain plausible deniability. In reality, everyone from Roosevelt on down knew exactly what this organization was and what it was going to do. The American Volunteer Group was born. Now Chennault needed planes. And here is where the P-40 Warhawk enters our story in a very specific and important way. The P-40, built by Curtiss-Wright, was America's primary frontline fighter in 1941. It was a solid, rugged aircraft with a lot of qualities going for it. But it also had a reputation, and that reputation was complicated. Military planners and aviation enthusiasts of the era often compared it unfavorably to the most advanced fighters of the day, particularly the British Spitfire and the German Messerschmitt Bf 109. The P-40 was considered by many to be a step behind the very best. But here is what Chennault understood that many others did not. The question was never whether the P-40 was the best fighter in the world in absolute terms. The question was whether the P-40, flown correctly by properly trained pilots using the right tactics against a specific enemy, could win. And Chennault believed the answer was absolutely yes. 100 P-40B Tomahawks, a variant of the Warhawk family, were diverted from a British order and made available for the American Volunteer Group. They were shipped to Burma in crates and assembled there. They were painted with the distinctive shark mouth insignia on the nose, a design borrowed from British RAF aircraft that had used a similar marking in North Africa. The effect was dramatic and immediately iconic. But before the planes, you needed the pilots. And recruiting them was an adventure all its own. Chennault and his recruiters fanned out across American military bases in late 1940 and early 1941, looking for volunteers. They were looking for experienced pilots, men who already knew how to fly and fight, men who could be ready quickly. And they offered something compelling: adventure, significant pay, and the chance to fly combat against a real enemy. The pay was genuinely extraordinary by the standards of the time. Pilots would earn $500 a month as a base salary, which was significantly more than they were making in the military. And here is the detail that became legendary almost immediately. They would receive a bonus of $500 for every confirmed Japanese aircraft they shot down. Word spread quickly. Applications came in. The recruiters were selective, but they found their men. Pilots, navigators, ground crew, mechanics, support personnel. By mid 1941, the American Volunteer Group was taking shape. The men who signed up were a fascinating cross-section of American military aviation. Some were seasoned veterans with years of experience. Some were younger, hungry for action, frustrated by the pace of peacetime military service. They came from the Army Air Corps, from the Navy, from the Marines. They had different backgrounds, different personalities, different reasons for volunteering. What they shared was skill, courage, and a willingness to go somewhere genuinely dangerous, to do something genuinely difficult. They converged on Rangoon, Burma, and then moved to a training base at Taungoo, where Chennault began the intensive process of turning a collection of talented individuals into a cohesive fighting force built around his very specific and carefully developed tactical philosophy. What Chennault taught those pilots over the weeks and months of training at Taungoo was nothing short of revolutionary, and it is worth spending real time understanding it, because it is the foundation of everything the Flying Tigers accomplished. The Japanese fighter pilots, particularly those flying the Mitsubishi A6M0, were genuinely extraordinary. The Zero was a remarkable aircraft. It was highly maneuverable, had exceptional range, and the pilots flying it, many of them combat veterans of years of fighting in China, were disciplined, aggressive, and skilled. In a traditional dogfight, a turning, swirling, close-quarters battle for position, the Zero held real advantages. It could outturn almost anything it faced. Chennault had studied this carefully. He had analyzed combat reports. He had watched films of aerial engagements. He understood both the Zero's strengths and, critically, its weaknesses. The Zero was maneuverable, but it was also relatively fragile. It had been built light to achieve its performance numbers, which meant it lacked armor protection for the pilot and self-sealing fuel tanks. A Zero that was hit solidly was a Zero that burned, and burned quickly. The Zero also had limitations in high-speed dives. At very high speeds, the aircraft's controls became heavy and difficult to manage. This meant that a faster aircraft, diving at high speed, could sometimes dictate terms of engagement that the Zero pilot could not easily counter. The P-40, for all its perceived shortcomings, had genuine strengths that Chennault recognized and built his tactics around. It was fast in a dive, faster than the Zero in a high-speed descent. It was rugged and could absorb significant damage and keep flying. It had good firepower, and it performed well at high altitudes. Chennault designed a tactical system specifically to exploit these factors. The P-40s would use altitude and the early warning network he had built to position themselves above approaching Japanese formations. They would dive on the enemy at high speed, fire, and then use their diving energy to break away and climb back to altitude for another pass. They would never, under any circumstances unless absolutely forced to, get into a turning dogfight with a Zero. That was a losing game. Hit and run. High-speed passes. Team tactics. Always maintain your energy. Never fight the enemy's fight. Fight your own fight on your own terms. He drilled these concepts into his pilots relentlessly. He showed them combat footage. He walked them through scenarios. He demanded that they understand not just the mechanics of what to do, but the reasoning behind every decision. This tactical system, which Chennault had been developing intellectually for years, now had an actual fighting force to execute it. And the results, when they finally came, would stun the world. The American Volunteer Group was officially activated in late July 1941, but they were still training when the world changed forever on December 7th, 1941, with a Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. In the hours and days that followed Pearl Harbor, the Japanese war machine launched simultaneous offensives across an enormous arc of Asia and the Pacific. They struck the Philippines. They struck Malaya. They struck Hong Kong. And they struck Rangoon. The American Volunteer Group had not yet seen combat. They had been training hard for months, but they were untested. Nobody knew for certain whether Chennault's tactics would work in real battle conditions against real Japanese pilots. The theory was sound. The training had been rigorous, but theory and training are one thing. Combat is another. The test came on December 20th, 1941, just 13 days after Pearl Harbor. On that morning, The early warning network that Chenault had so carefully built sent word that a formation of Japanese bombers was approaching Kunming, a major city in southwestern China and a critical hub for supplies coming in over the Burma Road. 10 Japanese twin-engine Ki-21 heavy bombers were inbound. Chenault scrambled his pilots. 2 flights of P-40s climbed to intercept. What happened next was the first real test of everything the Flying Tigers had built, and it was remarkable. The P-40s positioned themselves using the early warning intelligence. They had altitude. They had surprise, at least tactically, in that they knew where the enemy was and could choose when and how to engage. And when the moment came, they attacked exactly as Chenault had trained them. The results were devastating for the Japanese formation. By the accounts of the engagement, multiple Japanese bombers were shot down or damaged. The Japanese formation was broken up before it could reach its target. Not a single P-40 was lost. It was, in the language of military analysis, a perfect validation of the tactical doctrine. Everything Chenault had argued, everything he had trained, everything he had believed about how this kind of fight could be won, had just been demonstrated in actual combat. The Flying Tigers had announced themselves to the world. Word spread fast. In a war that, in its opening weeks, was delivering almost nothing but bad news for the Allied cause. The story of these American volunteer pilots shooting down Japanese aircraft over China was electric. Newspapers picked it up. Radio broadcasts carried the story. For an American public reeling from Pearl Harbor, desperate for any good news, any indication that the Japanese military machine could actually be stopped, the Flying Tigers were a godsend. The name itself came from a journalist, though the exact origin story is slightly disputed. Some accounts credit Time magazine correspondent Theodore White. Others point to a Chinese newspaper. But wherever it came from, it stuck immediately. The Flying Tigers. The name captured perfectly the combination of ferocity and speed and something wild and untamable that seemed to describe these men perfectly. The shark-mouthed P-40s became iconic almost overnight. That image, the teeth painted on the nose cowling, snarling as the aircraft dove toward its prey, became one of the defining visual images of the entire war. It was reproduced on posters, in newspapers, on the cover of magazines. It became a symbol not just of the Flying Tigers, but of American fighting spirit and American determination. But the men doing the fighting were not spending time on symbolism. They were fighting for their lives in the skies over China and Burma, day after brutal day. Let us talk about what the day-to-day reality of life with the Flying Tigers actually looked like, because the legend and the reality are both extraordinary, and you need to know both to understand what these men truly accomplished. They were based primarily at a series of airfields in China and Burma, with Kunming in Yunnan province, China, being the main operational base. The conditions were austere. The food was, to put it charitably, an acquired taste. The heat was ferocious. Disease was a constant threat. Malaria, dysentery, and various other ailments that go with operating in tropical conditions made life miserable for significant portions of the group. Supply was a perpetual nightmare. Spare parts for the P-40s were difficult to get. Engines wore out. Equipment broke down. The mechanics and ground crew performed near miracles on a daily basis, keeping aircraft flying that probably should have been grounded for maintenance. These men, the ground crew, are often overlooked in the romanticized telling of the Flying Tigers story. And that is genuinely unjust, because without them nothing flew and nothing fought. The pilots lived with a particular kind of stress that is hard to describe to anyone who has not experienced it. They knew that every time they climbed into a cockpit, they were going up against enemy pilots who were experienced, skilled, and motivated. The early warning system gave them important advantages, but it was not magic. Sometimes intelligence was incomplete. Sometimes the enemy had more planes than expected. Sometimes things just went wrong in ways nobody could predict. And they were always outnumbered. The American volunteer group at its peak had perhaps 80 to 90 serviceable aircraft. Japan had thousands. The Japanese could replace losses. The Flying Tigers essentially could not easily, not quickly. Every aircraft that was lost was a serious blow. Every pilot who was killed or wounded was irreplaceable on any meaningful timeline. This reality shaped everything about how Chenault demanded his pilots fight. There was no margin for error. There was no room for the kind of aggressive but wasteful tactics that might be acceptable if you had unlimited replacements. Every engagement had to be calculated. Every advantage had to be pressed. Every risk had to be weighed. It was, in many ways, the most demanding kind of leadership because it required convincing young, brave, aggressive pilots to constantly restrain their natural impulses in the name of tactical discipline. And it worked, but it worked because Chenault had earned the trust of his men through the quality of his thinking and the accuracy of his predictions. Let us talk about some of the specific battles and campaigns that define the Flying Tiger's operational history, because the details reveal both the tactical brilliance and the human cost of what these men accomplished. The defense of Rangoon was one of the most significant extended engagements of the Flying Tiger's combat career. Rangoon was the port city through which supplies flowed up the Burma Road into China. If Rangoon fell, the supply line was cut, and Japan, after Pearl Harbor, was pushing hard to take it. The Japanese launched massive air raids on Rangoon, sending formations of bombers escorted by fighters in waves designed to overwhelm the defenses. Against these raids, Chenault could deploy a handful of P-40s from the American Volunteer Group and a squadron of RAF Brewster Buffaloes flown by British Commonwealth pilots. The numerical disadvantage was stark. The Japanese could put up dozens of aircraft in a single formation. The defenders numbered in the tens. But Chenault's tactics, combined with the early warning network, turned what should have been a massacre into something else entirely. The P-40s would be waiting at altitude. They would dive through the Japanese formations at high speed, scatter the bombers, disrupt the coordinated attack, pick off targets of opportunity, and then climb back up for another pass. The Japanese formations, expecting to find minimal opposition or none at all, instead found themselves taking serious casualties from a well-organized, tactically disciplined defense. Over the weeks of the Rangoon campaign, the Flying Tiger's kill ratios against Japanese aircraft were extraordinary. The exact numbers have been debated by historians over the decades, and there is genuine scholarly discussion about how to properly credit confirmed versus probable kills, how to account for aircraft damaged versus destroyed, and how to reconcile American claims with Japanese records. But even the most conservative accounting of the Flying Tiger's combat record shows a kill ratio that was among the best achieved by any air unit on any side in the entire Second World War. And they did it while being outnumbered in virtually every engagement. Now I want to tell you about some of the individual pilots who made this story what it was, because it is important to remember that behind every statistic, behind every tactical diagram, behind every historical analysis, there are actual human beings who are scared and brave and brilliant and fallible and everything in between. Robert H. Scott was one of the pilots who became associated with the Flying Tiger story. Though he arrived slightly later, as part of the China Air Task Force that succeeded the AVG, Scott wrote a book about his experiences, God is My Co-Pilot, that became one of the most widely read books about aerial warfare of the entire Second World War. His writing captured something essential about what it felt like to be up there, alone in a cockpit, with the whole sky as your battlefield. Gregory Boyington, who would later become famous as Pappy Boyington, leading the Black Sheep Squadron with the Marines in the Pacific, served briefly with the Flying Tigers. Even this early in his career, his flying talent was evident, though his relationship with discipline and authority was, let us say, complicated. He clashed with Chenault and eventually left the group before its official disbanding. But his time with the Flying Tigers was formative. David Lee Tex Hill was one of the genuine stars of the group. A Navy pilot before joining the AVG, Hill was one of the top aces of the Flying Tigers, cool under pressure, tactically sophisticated, and with a natural gift for aerial combat. He was exactly the kind of pilot Chenault had been hoping to recruit, someone who could take the tactical philosophy and execute it instinctively even in the chaos of a real dogfight. John Van Kuren Newkirk, known as Scarsdale Jack, was another of the group's leading pilots and an important figure in the early combat operations. He was killed in action in March 1942 in a ground attack mission over Thailand. One of the reminders that even the best pilots, Even the men who seemed to have a charmed ability to survive could be taken at any moment. These men were human. They had bad days. They had moments of fear. They had disagreements with each other and with their commanders. Life in the forward bases was not glamorous. It was hot and dirty and exhausting and occasionally terrifying. But they kept getting back in the cockpits. They kept flying. They kept fighting. That matters. It matters enormously. The broader strategic context of the Flying Tigers campaign is worth examining carefully because it reveals how much their actions mattered beyond just the tactical statistics. China in 1941 and 1942 was a critical piece of the larger Allied strategic puzzle. Japan had been fighting in China for years, and China was absorbing enormous Japanese military resources that could not be used elsewhere in the Pacific or in Southeast Asia. Keeping China in the fight was enormously important to the overall Allied war effort. The Burma Road was the lifeline. As long as supplies could flow from Rangoon up through Burma and into China, China could keep fighting. If that supply line was cut, if China collapsed or negotiated a separate peace with Japan, the entire strategic situation in Asia changed dramatically and unfavorably for the Allies. The Flying Tigers' defense of the Burma Road supply line and their protection of Kunming and the other key nodes of the Chinese war effort was therefore not just a local military matter. It was strategically significant at the highest level of the war. Every Japanese bomber they shot down before it could destroy a supply depot was strategic value. Every Japanese formation they scattered before it could hit a critical airfield was strategic value. Every week they kept the Burma Road open was strategic value. You can measure some of this in aircraft destroyed and missions completed, but the real value was in what they prevented. They prevented the collapse of the Chinese war effort at its most vulnerable moment. That is not a small thing. That is arguably one of the significant contributions to Allied victory in the Second World War. But the story of the Flying Tigers was also, in some ways, a story about the limits of what even the most talented and dedicated small force can accomplish against an adversary with overwhelming resources. By early 1942, the situation in Burma was deteriorating badly. Japanese ground forces were advancing. The British defense of Malaya had collapsed, and Singapore fell in February 1942 in what Winston Churchill called the worst disaster in British military history. Japanese forces were pressing into Burma from multiple directions. The idea that Rangoon and the Burma Road could be held was becoming increasingly untenable. The Flying Tigers continued to fight. They continued to inflict casualties on Japanese air forces that were disproportionate to their own numbers. But they could not stop everything. They could not be everywhere. They could not replace the aircraft and pilots they lost with the speed that Japan could replace its losses. Rangoon fell in March 1942. The Burma Road was cut. China was now essentially besieged from a supply standpoint, with the only remaining route being the extraordinarily difficult air route over the Himalayas that would come to be known as the Hump, one of the most dangerous regular air routes in the world, with peaks reaching over 29,000 feet and weather that could kill an aircraft and crew with virtually no warning. The Flying Tigers adapted. They continued to defend Chinese airspace. They continued to harass Japanese supply lines and attack enemy positions. But the nature of the campaign had shifted. It was now a fight not to win in any near-term conventional sense, but to survive, to keep the Chinese war effort alive, to impose costs on the Japanese that made the occupation of China expensive enough to matter in the broader strategic calculation. Within all of this, the question of the P-40 itself is one that deserves deeper examination, because the aircraft is at the heart of the Flying Tiger story in ways that go beyond simple hardware specifications. The Curtiss P-40 family went through numerous variants over the course of the war. The P-40B Tomahawk that the Flying Tigers initially flew was followed by the P-40C, then the P-40E Kitty Hawk, then progressively improved versions designated P-40F, K, L, M, and N. Each variant addressed some of the previous model's shortcomings, while generally maintaining the aircraft's core characteristics. Those core characteristics defined what the P-40 was and was not. The aircraft was powered by an Allison V1710 liquid-cooled engine, later variants switching to the Packard-built Merlin engine for improved high-altitude performance. It had a top speed in the range of roughly 350 to 380 miles per hour, depending on variant and conditions, which was competitive but not exceptional for the era. Its armament was solid, typically 6.50 caliber machine guns in the wings and later variants, capable of devastating firepower at close range. But the P-40's real virtues were the ones Chenault had identified and built his tactics around: structural strength, diving speed, low-altitude performance, the ability to absorb punishment and keep flying. These were the qualities that mattered in the specific tactical context of the Flying Tigers operations, and they were the qualities that Chenault exploited to maximum effect. There's a broader lesson here that applies far beyond aerial warfare. Equipment is never good or bad in absolute terms. Equipment is good or bad relative to how it is used and against what enemy and in what conditions. The P-40, in the hands of pilots who understood its strengths and limitations, flying the tactic Chenault had developed, was a devastating weapon. The same aircraft flown differently by pilots who tried to make it do things it was not designed to do was vulnerable and limited. This is as true in business and in sport and in any competitive endeavor as it is in warfare. Know what you have. Know what your competition has. Build your strategy around your genuine strengths and their genuine weaknesses. Do not fight on terrain that favors your opponent if you can possibly avoid it. Chenault understood this as deeply as anyone who ever flew an aircraft, and he turned that understanding into victory. Let's talk about the human relationships within the Flying Tigers, because no account of this story is complete without acknowledging the complexity of the human dynamics at work. Chenault was not an easy man to work for. He was demanding, he was opinionated, he was sometimes difficult to argue with even when he might have been wrong about something specific. He had strong preferences and high standards, and he made those preferences and standards known clearly and consistently. But he had also earned something that cannot be faked and cannot be manufactured: the genuine respect of his pilots. They might have grumbled about him, as soldiers have grumbled about their commanders since the beginning of warfare, but they trusted his tactical judgment completely. And in the business of aerial combat, tactical judgment is the thing that keeps you alive. The pilots among themselves had the kind of bonds that form between people who share extreme experiences. They had been through things together that almost no one outside their group could truly understand. They had seen friends die. They had had their own close calls. They had sat in briefings knowing that the man next to them might not be there by the end of the day. These experiences create a particular kind of human connection that defies easy description. There was humor in it, the dark comedy that soldiers across history have used to process fear and loss. There was fierce loyalty. There was the occasional explosive argument between strong-willed men under enormous pressure. There was generosity and sometimes petty competition and all the other messy, complicated things that happen when you put a group of passionate, skilled, aggressive people together in a high-stakes environment. The Flying Tigers were not a collection of mythological heroes. They were human beings, which actually makes their achievements more impressive, not less. The question of what motivated these men to volunteer in the first place, and then to keep fighting once they were there, is one worth sitting with for a moment. Some of them were undoubtedly motivated primarily by the money. $500 a month plus bonuses was genuinely substantial compensation at a time when military pay was modest. There is no shame in acknowledging this. It was part of the recruiting pitch, and it worked. Some were motivated by adventure. Young men with flying skills in the late 1930s and early 1940s were a self-selecting group with a higher-than-average tolerance for risk and a higher-than-average appetite for excitement. The offer of going somewhere genuinely exotic to fly combat against a real enemy had a real appeal that went beyond the purely financial. Some were motivated by something that is harder to name, but that we might call a sense of justice. Japan's war in China had been going on for years, and the stories coming out of China, the massacres, the bombing of civilian populations, the systematic brutality of the occupation, were available to anyone who read the newspapers. Some of these men had a genuine sense that what Japan was doing in China was wrong and that doing something about it mattered. And some are motivated by something simpler and perhaps more universal: loyalty to the men beside them. Once you have been in combat with someone, once you have depended on someone for your life and had them depend on you, the reasons you originally showed up become less important than the fact that you are there and they are there and you are in it together. All of these motivations were present in different proportions in different men. What mattered was that they all produced the same result. Men who showed up, climbed into their aircraft, and flew. By mid-1942, changes were coming that would transform the Flying Tigers into something different. The United States was now fully at war after Pearl Harbor. The sprawling, informal, plausible deniability structure of the American volunteer group no longer made sense. The military needed to bring these pilots and their capabilities formally under American military command structure. The process of doing this was complicated, not least because many of the AVG pilots had become attached to the specific nature of their organization and were not necessarily enthusiastic about being absorbed into the regular military chain of command. On July 4th, 1942, the American Volunteer Group was officially disbanded and replaced by the 23rd Fighter Group of the United States Army Air Forces, which later became part of the China Air Task Force under Chennault's command. The 23rd was specifically designated to continue the traditions and the tactical heritage of the Flying Tigers. Its pilots inherited the shark-mouth painted aircraft, inherited the reputation, and inherited the responsibility of living up to a legend that had already formed in just 7 months of combat. The transition was not entirely smooth. Many of the original AVG pilots, their contracts fulfilled, chose not to re-enlist in the military. Some had been worn down by the months of intense combat. Some had personal reasons for returning home. Some were simply ready for a different chapter of their lives. But the organization, the tactical doctrine, the fighting identity, and the name carried forward. The 23rd Fighter Group continued fighting in the China theater throughout the war, and it continues to exist to this day as part of the United States Air Force, carrying forward a lineage that traces directly back to Chennault and his volunteers in those desperate months of late 1941 and early 1942. Chennault himself continued to fight the war in China. He was commissioned as a brigadier general in the United States Army Air Forces when the AVG was absorbed, and he eventually rose to the rank of major general. He commanded the China Air Task Force and then the 14th Air Force, which he worked tirelessly to build up from limited resources. His relationship with his military superiors remained complicated throughout. His most significant conflict was with General Joseph Vinegar Joe Stilwell, who commanded American forces in the China-Burma-India theater. Stilwell and Chennault had fundamentally different visions of strategy in China, different assessments of what was possible, and a mutual personal antipathy that made their professional disagreements considerably sharper than they might otherwise have been. Stilwell believed that the primary effort should be focused on rebuilding Chinese ground forces and reopening the Burma Road by reconquering Burma from Japanese occupation. Chennault believed that his air forces could make the decisive difference if they were given adequate resources, specifically fuel and aircraft and personnel, which had to be flown over the hump at extraordinary cost and effort. The debate between them went all the way up to Roosevelt and eventually to the combined chiefs of staff. It was a genuine strategic disagreement between two capable, experienced men who both had legitimate arguments and both had significant blind spots. History has not rendered a simple verdict on who was right, because the full truth is that they were both partially right and both partially wrong in ways that the limitations of their respective positions made it very difficult for either of them to see clearly. What the debate cost the war effort was resources, attention, and time, all of which were in desperately short supply in the China theater throughout the war. Chennault eventually prevailed in terms of receiving increased resources and support for his air forces, and the 14th Air Force became a genuinely significant fighting organization. But the constraints of operating in China, the supply limitations, the political complexities of the relationship with the Chinese nationalist government, and the reality that China was not the primary theater of operations in the overall Allied strategy, always limited what could be accomplished. The legacy of the Flying Tigers is something that has been celebrated, studied, debated, and sometimes mythologized in the 8 decades since those 7 months of combat in 1941 and 1942. It is worth being clear-eyed about both what the legacy is and what it is not. The Flying Tigers were not, by themselves, decisive in winning the war against Japan. The war in the Pacific was won through a combination of factors. Industrial production on a scale Japan could not match, naval power at sea and in the air demonstrated at Midway and in the Solomons campaign, the island-hopping strategy that brought American air power progressively closer to the Japanese home islands, and the final terrible application of atomic weapons at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. China's continued resistance to Japan throughout the war did have strategic value. It kept large numbers of Japanese ground forces tied down on the Asian continent that might otherwise have been available elsewhere. The Flying Tigers and the air forces that succeeded them contributed to keeping China in the fight. This matters, even if it is not the kind of direct, decisive victory that popular history tends to celebrate most enthusiastically. What the Flying Tigers proved as a matter of tactics and leadership and organizational effectiveness is both more specific and in some ways more remarkable than their broader strategic contribution. They proved that a small, well-trained, well-led force, fighting with the right weapons in the right way against the right targets, could achieve disproportionate results against a much larger enemy. They proved that tactical doctrine and intelligent preparation matter enormously, that it is not enough to have brave pilots if those pilots are flying the wrong tactics. They prove that leadership based on knowledge and demonstrated competence can earn the kind of trust that makes extraordinary performance possible. These are lessons that are as relevant to military organizations today as they were in 1941. And they are relevant well beyond military organizations to any situation where an underdog faces a much more powerful opponent and has to find a way to compete effectively with limited resources. The individual human stories that emerge from the Flying Tigers are part of the legacy too, and they deserve to be remembered. 26 pilots from the American Volunteer Group were killed in action or died from wounds during the group's 7 months of combat. Several more died in accidents or from disease. These men gave their lives in the service of a cause that was not yet officially their country's cause, in a distant country that most Americans at the time could not have found on a map, against an enemy that had not yet attacked the United States. They volunteered, they showed up, they flew, and some of them did not come home. Their names are in the records. Their faces are in the photographs that survive. Young men squinting into the sun on dusty airfields in Burma and China. Some of them clearly trying to project confidence and toughness. Some of them looking exactly as young as they were. Looking at those photographs today, knowing what they were about to go through, knowing that some of them were already very close to the end of their lives, is a genuinely moving experience. History tends to smooth things out. The rough edges get polished away. The confusion and the fear and the exhaustion get replaced by clean narrative arcs and crisp tactical summaries. The men themselves, in all their complicated human reality, get transformed into legend. The legend is not wrong, exactly. The Flying Tigers really were extraordinary. Their record really was remarkable. Chennault really was a tactical genius of a particular and rare kind. The P-40 really did prove itself, in the right hands, to be a formidable weapon. But the men behind the legend were just men. Tired and scared and brave and skilled, and sometimes petty and sometimes transcendently selfless. Human beings doing the hardest possible thing in the worst possible conditions, day after day for months. That is the real story, and that story is worth telling. The shark mouth on the nose of the P-40 became one of the most recognizable images of the entire Second World War. It has been reproduced on aircraft ever since, from American fighter planes to modern jets, as a tribute to the men who first made that marking famous over the skies of China and Burma. You can see it on A-10 Thunderbolts even today. You can see it at air shows, on model aircraft, on the artwork that military enthusiasts produce about the golden age of fighter aviation. The image endures because it captures something true. There is something fierce and defiant about those shark-mouthed P-40s, something that said, "We are here, we are coming, and we are not afraid of you." Against impossible odds, with limited resources, in a theater that the world was barely paying attention to, those aircraft and the men who flew them refused to be beaten. They scratched and clawed and fought and hurt the enemy far beyond what any rational calculation of forces would have predicted. They did it through skill and through courage and through the specific tactical genius of a retired Army captain from Texas who had been told his ideas were wrong and who spent his whole career being proved right. As we come toward the end of this story, I want to bring things back to the P-40 Warhawk itself one final time, because there is something important to say about it that the full context of the Flying Tiger story makes possible to understand. The P-40 was not the best fighter of the Second World War. The Spitfire was probably a more elegant and high-performing aircraft in absolute terms. The Mustang, which came later in the war, was probably the finest American piston-engine fighter ever built. The Zero had genuine performance advantages that were real and had to be respected. But the P-40, in the hands of the Flying Tigers, became something that none of those aircraft were in that specific moment and place. It became a symbol of resistance. It became proof that the right people with the right ideas could take a weapon that others had written off as second-rate and use it to do something extraordinary. The lesson is not that the P-40 was secretly better than everyone thought. The lesson is that the quality of the tool matters less than the skill and wisdom with which it is used. Chennault did not waste time wishing he had Spitfires. He took the P-40s he had and figured out how to make them lethal in his specific context. That is the kind of thinking that wins. The Flying Tigers flew for 7 months as the American Volunteer Group. 7 months of combat that produced a record of achievement that military historians continue to study and admire. When the group was disbanded in July 1942 and reorganized as the 23rd Fighter Group, the fighting did not stop. It continued under new organizational forms for the rest of the war. But those 7 months, December 1941 through July 1942, those specific months when a handful of American volunteers climbed into their shark-mouthed P-40s and took on the Japanese air forces over China and Burma, those months belong to history in a particular and irreducible way. They were the months when the Flying Tigers proved what was possible, when Chennault's ideas were tested against reality and came back vindicated. When the men who had signed up for adventure and money and justice and brotherhood found themselves making history without, in many cases, fully realizing that is what they were doing. They were just trying to survive, just trying to protect the airfields and the supply lines and the cities that depended on them, just trying to do their jobs and get back on the ground in one piece. The fact that they did it with such extraordinary skill and such extraordinary results is a tribute to Chennault's leadership, to the tactics he developed, to the rugged capability of the P-40 Warhawk, and above all to the courage and skill of the men themselves. The Flying Tigers, American volunteers, defenders of China, warriors of the sky, their story does not get old. Their story does not fade, because it is a story about something permanent and true about what human beings are capable of when they are well-led, well-trained, and refuse to accept that the numbers make victory impossible. Against inferior numbers, with an aircraft most people had written off, in a corner of the world that barely made the front pages, they fought, they won, and they showed the world something it needed desperately to see in those dark early months of the Second World War. They showed the world that Japan could be beaten in the air. Everything that came afterward, every Pacific victory, every island taken, every Japanese aircraft shot down over every ocean from 1942 to 1945 was built on a foundation that included those 7 months over China and Burma, those shark-mouthed P-40s, those American volunteers, and the genius and stubbornness of Claire Lee Chennault. That is the legacy of the Flying Tigers. That is the story of the P-40 Warhawk. And now, you know it too. Thank you for spending this time with history. These stories deserve to be told. These men deserve to be remembered. And if this journey through one of the most remarkable chapters of aerial warfare history has lit any fire of curiosity in you, I hope you will keep exploring. Because the history of men and women who gave everything in service of something larger than themselves is, without question, the most important history there is.